Morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well, staying safe after this first few days of school. And I appreciate you joining us this morning as we continue a small series we have here for Sunday school on kind of the church and contemporary issues. Last week we talked about Christ, creation, and the coronavirus. And we looked at what does it mean, where is God in the pandemic? How do we think theologically about COVID-19? How do we think about Christ's death and resurrection? And how does that give us a message of hope to share as we go back to school? And really what we were discussing, the central idea was that when Christ is put to death, and then when Christ comes out of the grave, Christ signifies and he represents and he inaugurates the new creation, the restoration of all things. That when God creates the universe, his intention isn't to just kind of scrap creation, to throw it away, and that we all kind of whisk away to some spiritual realm. No, what God cares about is his creation. And what God intends to do through Jesus is to restore all things. And that includes humanity, but it also includes the rest of creation. And we see this in the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so that gives us a message of hope to share with our family, with our friends, with our schoolmates, with whomever we come in contact with, that yes, we live in a time of fear and of chaos and of death and of suffering, and all these things are particularly heightened right now because of the coronavirus, but we also have a very real sense of hope that God is not done working, that God has already declared victory over all sin and all death and all suffering, and that we see that worked in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we know that this has also been promised to us who have faith and who are part of God's church, but also for all of creation. And so we invite others to participate and to join this family. So that's mostly what we mentioned last week. We're going to continue to talk about Christ's creation and the coronavirus today, and step back and look at a few texts in Genesis that talk about creation and our role as the people of God in taking care of creation, and then further, what does that mean for us, particularly in a time of this crisis of COVID-19. So there's a couple of texts from Genesis that we're going to read, one from chapter 1 and one from chapter 2, and I'll get to those here in a second. Whenever we read Genesis, particularly when we read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, we get into these kind of large debates about what does Genesis mean, what's the historicity of it, how do we read the creation accounts in the Bible, and how do we understand those things with modern scientific theories and understandings about the world and evolution and Big Bang and all these other sort of things. And we've touched on those things in youth several times, and I don't want to go over them all right now. But as we read these texts, really what we're focusing on is what is the Genesis telling us theologically about our role as people? And what does it tell us theologically about God's role as creator and us being made in the image of God? Okay? Now, we can draw this debate out and talk about other things, but let's just focus on these things for the time being. What do these texts tell us about our role as God's creation? Our role as people made in the image and in the likeness of God? And what does that mean for us in times of crisis? What does that mean for us in times of struggle, in times of suffering? I think that these texts can tell us a lot about how we need to be responding to COVID and how we can share, once again, this message of hope and the message of purpose, right? If last week was a message of hope, really this week is a message of purpose. What are we here for? What is our responsibility as Christians and to take care of creation and to take care of one another? So that's the big question. I'm going to read these two texts. They're very short, and we'll just kind of talk about them as we move along. The first one is Genesis 1, verses 26 through 27. And this will sound very familiar to you. This is, I'll read this out of the NIV, starting in verse 26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So in Genesis 1, we have the 7 days of creation. And each day, the first couple of days, God is creating, he is forming something out of nothing, right? He's taking creation, or he's taking nothingness, and he's bringing things into being. And then the second set of 3 days, God is taking that what he formed, and now he's filling it with life. And so there's kind of a balance, a parallel here. And so on the 6th day, God is filling up the earth with animals. And the last bit of creation here that I just read is God creating humanity. My text says mankind, some say humankind, some say man. But the idea is that God is creating humanity, right? Not individual persons, but this is the idea of God creating all people, humankind, people in general. And we see that God creates them male and female, but most importantly, that God has created them in the image of God. And for what purpose? Verse 26 says, God has created them so that they may rule over the fish and the sea, the birds of the sky, livestock, and all these other sort of things, right? So God has granted humanity with a task, with a purpose. And the purpose is to kind of rule over the rest of creation. Some texts say rule, some say to have dominion over, some say to subjugate. And some of these words sound kind of harsh, right? Dominion sounds like an authoritarian emperor that kind of strikes down and declares judgment. To subjugate sounds harsh. It sounds, right, it kind of has like this slavery overtone. To rule over, we don't like being ruled over. We kind of want to have, the freedom to make our own decisions, to do what we want to do. We don't like having people making those decisions for us. But the idea is that God has created humanity with a distinct vocation, a distinct role to play in the cosmos, and that's to take care of the rest of creation. And I think this is exactly what Genesis is talking about when it says we've been made in the image of God, right? We've been made in the image of God in the sense that in the same way that God creates, in the same way that God reigns and rules and has authority, so he has delegated this kind of role to humanity in the cosmos and in creation. So God has created humanity as small representations of God, right? We are creators. We make stuff, right? We don't bring it out of nothingness in the same way that God does, but we take things and we mold them and we form them and we fill them, and we direct and we have authority and we reign and we rule and we do these sort of things as reflections, as images of what God has already done on the large scale and what God continues to do. And so we have been made God's representatives on earth. This is what it means to be part of humanity. It doesn't mean that the image of God doesn't mean that we look like God. All right, it doesn't mean that God is a bigger version of ourselves or a more perfect image physically of ourselves. It doesn't mean that we think critically in the same way God thinks critically. But maybe it means that we have this special relationship with God, and that we have a similar vocation to God here on earth, or here in all creation. And so Genesis, the days are kind of building up, and here we get to 6, and it's the pinnacle of God's creation, and he makes these creatures in the image of God, and their role is to care for creation, right? We see in these other kind of ancient creation texts, people are made, and they're made just to be slaves for God, the gods. They're made to do all the hard work that God doesn't want to do. But we don't see that here. This is a good thing. There's no indication that work is a bad thing. It's just part of what it means to be human. It's not part of what it just means to be a male or a female, but together as people, that we come together and we care for God's good creation together. This is what it means to be human. We see a very similar thing in the next chapter, Genesis 2. So Genesis 1, we kind of have big picture. We have this the 7-day creation, and it moves. It's balanced, and it's almost like a hymn, right? It's this beautiful work of art that talks about God's creation, and how it's balanced, and how it moves together. In Genesis 2, we kind of get this close-up view of God creating, right? In Genesis 1, God speaks things into creation. The language it uses is God, but when you get to Genesis 2, it's close up God forming the man, the Adam, out of the dirt, And instead of calling him God, it's Yahweh, right? His personal name. We get this kind of zoomed in image of God getting his hands dirty, so to speak. God the farmer in the garden, creating this human. And so God creates this person. He's not named Adam yet. They just call him the man, the Adam. And when we get to verse 15, it says that God, the Lord God, the Yahweh God, took the man, the person, and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. And so what we saw in Genesis 1, the large picture, humanity being called to take care of creation, here we see kind of the close-up. God putting the Adam, the person, in the garden and giving him the task of working in the garden and taking care of it. And we see quickly right after this, right, that the man and the woman, they sin, they fall into temptation because of the serpent, and that there's some corruption that goes on in creation because of that. Now the gardening is a lot more difficult. Now childbearing has pain, and now there's enmity between the woman and the serpent, and there's enmity between the man and the woman. So we see all those things go wrong starting in Genesis 3 and throughout the rest of the Bible. But here in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, we have these idyllic pictures, these idealistic images of what does it mean for us, and what is our task as people of God, who recognize and worship our Creator. And what Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 both seem to be saying is that we've been tasked with the responsibility of taking care of creation, of loving it, of tending it, and caring for it to the best of our ability. And yes, we've not always done a good job, right? We look around in human history, we look around the world right now, and we see lots of things have gone wrong. I mean, you think about the endless amounts of wars that have gone on. That's not us taking care of one another. That's not us taking care of our creation. You think about the pollution, all the issues that have been going on there. You think about the diseases and the pandemics that have happened throughout history, not just the current one. These things in which we see creation suffer. In the same way that people suffer, creation suffers. You see creation corrupted, decaying, and undergoing its own sort of death. And some of that's not necessarily because of humanity, but some of it is. And some of it's our own lack of care for creation, right? There's been a lot of talk about climate change and the globe getting hotter and hotter. And there seems to be a lot of indications that that's because of the way that we treat creation, and that we need to be, as Christians, taking more responsibility for that and speaking out against that. We think about the current coronavirus, that this almost certainly happened because of, somebody, these kind of unregulated wet markets in China, and we're not going to blame it on the Chinese people. You can criticize, lack of oversight, and that's fine. But there's an unregulation here on taking care of creation. And because of that, this virus has jumped over from the pangolins, and it's moved now into this kind of deadly virus for our humanity. And we read the Old Testament. We see that God gave the ancient Israelites certain food laws. And there was a lot of close attention to how the Jews, what they could eat, what they were allowed to do, what they were allowed to participate in. There were certain ways that they had to cleanse themselves. And there was a lot of these holy purity laws. And part of that is just to take care of the community, to take care of the land, right? They couldn't farm every single year. They had to take off every 7th year, Sabbath year. And so when we read the Old Testament, there's all these sort of laws and guidelines on how to make sure we take care of one another and take care of creation. And in the modern church, for us here in Gatesville and us in America, sometimes we lose sight of that. Sometimes we kind of get in the mindset of we can just do whatever we want to do. We're trying to succeed, we're trying to make money, we're trying to do well and be successful people. And because of that, we forget that we've been put here not just to go to heaven, but to be God's representatives, to be God's people on earth, as it is in heaven, right? To be a foretaste, to be a prefigurement of what God and what the kingdom of God is going to look like in the future. This is why Christ came, right? Jesus came to inaugurate, to establish a new type of kingdom and a new type of people, right? When we read Colossians, the beginning of Colossians, Paul says that all things were created through Jesus, and all things were created for him. They find their completion and their purpose in him. So when Christ goes to the cross and when he's resurrected, he inaugurates this restoration of all creation. And he shows us as a person what it means to be fully human, right? Jesus is God, but Jesus is also fully human. He shows us what it means for us to be the people of God. He goes and he heals the broken, right? And he ministers to the sick. And Jesus cares for the downtrodden and the oppressed. And Jesus restores those people he comes in contact with. And it's a model of what we also are supposed to be doing as the church, right? We may not experience the same sort of miracles that are listed in the Gospels and Acts, but we may, right? People have been reporting that for millennia. But no matter what it looks like, the important thing is that we recognize that as the people of God, we have a responsibility to take care of our neighbors, to take care of creation, and to give a message of purpose and a message of hope to all the people that we come in contact with. And I think that we do that when we read the Genesis stories well. We read them as a message of who we are as people and what our vocation and what our task is. Okay? So if we think about last week and we think about the resurrection as a message of hope that we share, then this week we read Genesis and we think about a message of purpose that we share. That we're here for a reason. That reason, yes, is to worship God, to glorify God, but that reason is also for us to be God's presence and be God's image here on earth, to take care of one another, to take care of creation, and to show love and tenderness and restoration in every way that we can. I pray that we find ways to do that in this time of crisis, and I pray that we find ways to share that message with everyone that we come in contact with. I hope that you guys are continuing to stay safe. Please reach out if you need anything, and we're continuing to pray for you at school.